March 1st, 2006, 7 p.m. 11-year-old Joe Geeling, a boy known for his humor and infectious energy, didn't come home from school. His family, concerned but hopeful, began to search. As hours stretched into a sleepless night, fear crept in. The following morning, in Whitehead Park in Bury, Greater Manchester, their worst fears were realized. Joe's body was found beaten and stabbed. A vibrant young life had been extinguished in an act of unimaginable violence. But the most chilling revelation? The perpetrator wasn't a stranger. It was a boy barely older than Joe himself, 14-year-old Michael Hamer, a fellow classmate. How does this happen? How does a child, not even old enough to drive, carry out such a calculated and brutal act? These are the questions that haunt this case. Joe Geeling was the embodiment of joy, a boy who lit up every room he entered, popular among his peers, adored by his family, and resilient in the face of cystic fibrosis. He was the kind of child others naturally gravitated toward. Michael Hamer, on the other hand, lived in shadows, a boy who struggled to find his place. He faced relentless bullying and carried the weight of rejection from a young age. At home, his life was far from ideal. On the surface, their lives couldn't have been more different, but their paths intersected in a way that would devastate a family, shatter a community, and leave an entire nation grappling with the uncomfortable realities of childhood violence. What led to this tragic encounter? Was Michael Hamer driven by rage, jealousy, or something else entirely? And what does this case reveal about the unseen struggles of children who are failed by the systems meant to protect them? We'll unravel the layers of this case, examining not only the crime itself, but the lives that led to it. Along the way, we'll confront difficult questions about morality, psychology, and the factors that shape a young mind toward destruction. Stay with us as we piece together the timeline, the evidence, and the truths that emerged from one of the most heartbreaking crimes in recent memory. Joe Geeling was more than just a child. He was a beacon of light in the lives of everyone who knew him. Born into a loving and tightly knit family, Joe grew up surrounded by care and support. His parents, Tom and Gwen, worked tirelessly to provide a nurturing environment where he and his siblings could thrive. Home was a place filled with laughter, shared meals, and small moments of joy that Joe cherished. From an early age, Joe had to grapple with a challenge that many of us will never truly understand. He was born with cystic fibrosis, a genetic condition that impacted his lungs and digestive system. Despite the daily battles with his health, Joe never allowed his illness to define him. He faced his treatments and hospital visits with a resilience that amazed even the medical staff who treated him. His parents often recounted how Joe would crack jokes with the nurses during his hospital stays, lightening the mood for everyone around him. It was this unwavering optimism, this ability to find joy even in the darkest moments, that set Joe apart. At school, Joe was a magnet for friendship. He wasn't just popular in the superficial way we often associate with childhood cliques. Joe was truly beloved. Teachers admired his determination and kindness. Fellow students gravitated toward his infectious humor and playful energy. He had a knack for making everyone feel included, whether it was through his cheeky remarks during class or his willingness to lend a hand to a classmate in need. One of his teachers later recalled a moment that encapsulated Joe's spirit. During a school fundraiser, when some students were hesitant to participate, Joe was the first to step up and lead the charge. He wasn't doing it for attention or praise. He simply wanted everyone to have fun. That was the kind of person Joe was. Joe's cystic fibrosis meant that he had to be cautious, but it also gave him a unique perspective on life. He lived each day with an urgency to experience as much joy as possible, whether it was riding his bike around the neighborhood, playing pranks on his siblings, or curling up with a good book. Joe found happiness in the little things. His community in Bury, Greater Manchester, also played a significant role in his life. Joe's friendly nature made him a familiar face to shopkeepers, neighbors, and classmates. People often described him as the kind of child who would stop and chat with anyone, always ready with a smile or a witty comment. He had an undeniable charm that made him unforgettable to those who crossed his path. But perhaps what stood out most about Joe was his empathy. He had a natural ability to sense when someone needed a kind word or a listening ear. Friends who were struggling often found solace in Joe's company. He didn't just listen. He made you feel understood. Despite his outgoing and cheerful nature, Joe was also deeply trusting, perhaps too trusting. He saw the good in everyone, even when others didn't. It was a quality that made him beloved, but also one that made him vulnerable. Looking back, this trusting nature would become a tragic thread in the story of Joe's life. He had no reason to doubt the people around him. He believed in the best of humanity, in the goodness of others, and it was this belief that would ultimately lead him into harm's way. Joe Geeling's life was a testament to the strength of the human spirit. He faced challenges that would have weighed heavily on anyone, yet he carried them with grace and an unshakable sense of joy. He was a son, a brother, a friend, and an inspiration to everyone who knew him. In remembering Joe, we don't just mourn a life cut short. We celebrate the incredible person he was. His story reminds us of the profound impact one child can have on an entire community and the fragility of trust in a world that isn't always kind. Joe Geeling was loved, and that love, in the end, makes the loss all the more devastating. Michael Hamer's life began under the weight of absence. Before he even entered the world, his father had already decided not to be a part of it. For most children, parents' presence provides a foundation, a sense of stability to lean on. For Michael, that foundation was fractured before he ever took his first breath. Growing up in Barrie, Greater Manchester, Michael lived in a household where love was scarce and understanding seemed even scarcer. His mother, though present physically, struggled to bridge the emotional distance between herself and her son. This wasn't due to lack of effort. She was a single parent trying to hold things together. But Michael needed more than she could give. He craved affection, reassurance, and validation, needs that went unmet. From a young age, Michael learned to cope with the void in ways that only deepened his isolation. At home, he spent much of his time alone. The walls of his small bedroom became his refuge, a place where he could escape the rejection he often felt in the world outside. When he entered school, the challenges multiplied. For children, school can be a place of discovery and friendship, but for Michael, it became a battleground. He was a target for bullies, picked on for reasons as trivial as the way he looked or the way he spoke. Each unkind word, each shove in the hallway, added another layer to the walls Michael built around himself. He wanted to fit in. He longed to be part of the groups that laughed together at lunch or planned weekend adventures. But no matter how hard he tried, Michael always seemed to be on the periphery. When he did muster the courage to join in, he was met with ridicule or outright rejection. Over time, he stopped trying altogether. Teachers noticed Michael's struggles, but their interventions, well-meaning as they were, often missed the mark. They saw a quiet, withdrawn boy and assumed he simply needed time to adjust. They didn't see the weight he carried or the silent anger growing inside him. At home, Michael's relationship with his mother became increasingly strained. She, too, carried her own burdens, trying to make ends meet and manage the responsibilities of single parenthood. While she provided for Michael's physical needs, the emotional connection he desperately needed was absent. He began to internalize these experiences, blaming himself for the rejection and neglect. He wasn't just a boy who felt unloved. He started to believe he was unlovable. As Michael entered adolescence, these feelings began to manifest in troubling ways. He became fixated on the differences between himself and others, particularly those he envied. In his mind, life was a game he had already lost. Others had friends, opportunities, and families who adored them, while he was left with emptiness. One of the boys Michael envied most was Joe Geeling. Joe represented everything Michael felt he lacked. Joe was popular, loved, and full of life, a stark contrast to Michael's loneliness. For Michael, seeing Joe wasn't just a reminder of what he didn't have. It was a reminder of what he believed he could never have. Psychologists often speak of the long-term effects of emotional neglect on a child's development. Patterns of rejection, isolation, and unmet needs can create a storm within a young mind, leading to feelings of worthlessness, resentment, and anger. Michael's life was a case study in how these factors could come together to devastating effect. There were warning signs, small, seemingly insignificant moments that, in hindsight, painted a clearer picture of the turmoil within him. Michael began to withdraw even further, avoiding interactions that might leave him exposed to rejection. When he did interact, his emotions often swung between quiet compliance and bursts of anger that startled those around him. His academic performance suffered, but it wasn't just his grades that declined. Teachers began to notice his lack of engagement, his reluctance to participate in class discussions, and the way he avoided eye contact. At times, Michael showed glimpses of vulnerability, moments where he seemed desperate for connection. But those moments were fleeting, quickly buried beneath layers of defensiveness and fear of being hurt again. By the time he reached his teenage years, Michael's isolation had become a way of life. He no longer sought approval or friendship. He assumed it wasn't meant for him. Instead, he turned inward, retreating into his thoughts and fantasies. But isolation has a way of distorting reality. Without external voices to challenge his perceptions, Michael's thoughts became darker, more distorted. The resentment he felt toward others grew, fueled by years of rejection and unmet needs. It's crucial to understand that these experiences don't excuse Michael's actions. They don't lessen the horror of what he would later do. But they do provide context, a glimpse into the making of a young mind that, step by step, drifted further from empathy, further from connection, and further into a dangerous place where anger and envy took hold. As we continue this story, we'll explore how these early experiences shaped the choices Michael made, choices that would ultimately lead to a tragedy that shocked a nation. The events leading to Joe Geeling's tragic death were as calculated as they were unsettling. Michael Hamer, just 14 years old, began crafting a plan that would change the lives of countless people forever. It started with a single piece of paper. Michael, familiar with the routines and dynamics of his school, forged a note that would appear to come from a teacher. The message was simple, innocuous enough to avoid raising immediate alarm, but persuasive enough to convince Joe to follow its instructions. The note instructed Joe to visit Michael's home after school under the pretense of an important meeting. It played on the natural trust that Joe had in his teachers and peers, a trust that Michael knew he could exploit. But the plan wasn't flawless. When Joe showed the note to one of his teachers, she immediately recognized something was off. The handwriting wasn't quite right, and the phrasing felt strange. Concerned, the teacher warned Joe to be cautious, even suggesting that he ignore the note altogether. Joe hesitated. He was young but not naive, and the teacher's warning clearly gave him pause. Yet Michael's demeanor, calm and insistent, managed to erode Joe's doubts. Michael reassured him that everything was legitimate, and eventually, Joe agreed to follow. It's moments like these that linger painfully in hindsight. If Joe had listened to his instincts, if the teacher had pressed harder, if someone had intervened more forcefully, would the outcome have been different? These are the what-ifs that haunt this story. The walk to Michael's home was unremarkable. Two boys heading in the same direction after school. To any observer, they might have appeared as friends, their path blending seamlessly into the routine of the neighborhood. Joe, likely still a bit uncertain, carried no sense of the danger that awaited him. Michael, on the other hand, was composed, focused. He had meticulously planned for this moment, and every step brought him closer to its execution. Once inside Michael's house, the atmosphere changed. The familiar safety of school was replaced by the unsettling isolation of an empty home. Michael's mother was not there, leaving the boys entirely alone. Michael led Joe to the kitchen, where the conversation likely began casually, perhaps about school or shared classmates. But underneath the surface, tension was building. Michael's intentions were not casual, and as the minutes passed, his behavior began to shift. Joe may have noticed small cues, an unusual tone in Michael's voice, a strange look in his eye. Perhaps he even began to feel uneasy, though he wouldn't have had the context to fully understand why. As Michael's true intentions became clearer, Joe's unease turned to alarm. Michael made an inappropriate advance, a moment that would set the tragic course of events into motion. Joe, shocked and repelled, immediately resisted. He told Michael no, firmly and unequivocally. He threatened to leave, to tell someone what had happened. But it was this rejection, this assertion of boundaries, that sparked something in Michael. Rejection is a powerful trigger, especially for someone like Michael, who had spent his life feeling rejected by the world around him. In that moment, the years of pain, isolation, and frustration boiled over. Michael's calm facade shattered, replaced by anger and desperation. He lashed out, grabbing a frying pan from the nearby counter. The first blow was sudden, shocking, and brutal. Joe, unprepared for such violence, tried to fight back, but the situation had spiraled beyond his control. Michael, fueled by rage and panic, continued the attack. The blows were not only an expression of his frustration, they were a desperate attempt to silence Joe, to prevent him from leaving or exposing what had happened. In the chaos, Michael's anger grew. He grabbed a knife, escalating the violence to a horrifying degree. Joe was stabbed repeatedly, each act more frenzied than the last. By the time it was over, Joe lay lifeless on the floor. The bright, cheerful boy who had brought so much joy to those around him was gone. And Michael? He stood in the aftermath of his actions, blood on his hands, the weight of what he had done beginning to sink in. But instead of remorse, his next action suggested something even more chilling, a calculated effort to cover his tracks. These moments, from the forged note to the brutal attack, illustrate not just the darkness within Michael Hamer, but the devastating consequences of his actions. Joe Geeling's trust, his kindness, and his willingness to see the good in others were exploited in the worst possible way. The story doesn't end here, but these moments mark the point where a terrible plan became an irreversible reality. The events that unfolded in Michael Hamer's home that afternoon marked a chilling descent into violence, one that no one could have anticipated. What began as a quiet interaction between two classmates escalated into a scene of unimaginable horror. Michael stood in his kitchen, his mind racing. Joe had rejected him, spoken words that Michael, in his fragile emotional state, could not handle. To Michael, that rejection was not just personal. It felt like a final confirmation of every fear, every insecurity he had ever harbored. The frying pan was within reach. It wasn't premeditated in the strictest sense, more a response born of impulse, of a need to silence the feelings Joe's words had triggered. With a sudden movement, Michael grabbed it and struck Joe with a force that sent the boy reeling. Joe, disoriented and in pain, tried to defend himself. His protests were likely filled with desperation, pleas for Michael to stop, to let him go. But Michael's anger had overtaken him, blinding him to reason, to compassion, to the humanity of the boy in front of him. Each blow of the frying pan was more forceful than the last, driven by a combination of fear and fury. But even as Joe's strength began to fade, Michael's assault did not. He reached for a knife, escalating the violence in a way that would seal the tragic fate of his classmate. The first stab was frenzied, an act of desperation. The subsequent ones were no less brutal. 16 times Michael plunged the knife into Joe, each act more chaotic than the last. Blood soaked the floor of the walls, evidence of the nightmare that had unfolded. As Michael stood over Joe's lifeless body, the gravity of what he had done seemed to hang in the air. But what followed next was perhaps even more disturbing. There was no wailing, no visible breakdown. Instead, Michael's response was chillingly methodical. Michael began cleaning the scene. He moved Joe's body, wiping down surfaces and gathering items that bore traces of his crime. To an outsider, his actions might have appeared as though he were completing a routine task rather than covering up a heinous act of violence. He dragged Joe's body to a location he deemed suitable for disposal, a nearby park. It was a place Joe had likely visited many times, a place meant for community and life. Yet now, it would become the resting place for a child whose life had been stolen far too soon. As he worked, Michael's demeanor was calm, detached. He wiped his hands clean, changed his clothes, and discarded the weapon. By the time he left the scene, it was as though he had compartmentalized the crime, shutting it away in a part of his mind he didn't plan to revisit. He returned to his routine, blending back into the world outside, at school, on the streets. Meanwhile, Joe's family was becoming increasingly worried. Evening had fallen, and Joe hadn't come home. His parents called neighbors, friends, and the school, asking if anyone had seen him. The search began almost immediately. Dozens of people rallied together, combing the streets and parks, calling out Joe's name. As hours turned into a restless night, the community's concern turned to fear. By morning, the worst fears were confirmed. Joe's body was discovered in Whitehead Park. News spread quickly, and the town of Barry was plunged into shock and grief. Joe's parents were inconsolable. Their bright, joyful son, who had faced so many challenges with a smile, was gone. Neighbors and friends shared in their anguish, recounting memories of Joe's laughter, his kindness, his unwavering spirit. One local resident described the collective heartbreak. It felt like we had all lost someone dear to us. Joe wasn't just a part of his family. He was a part of this community. And now he was gone. The contrast between the growing panic of the search and Michael's eerie calmness was stark. While hundreds of people prayed for Joe's safe return, Michael carried on as though nothing had happened. But beneath the surface, there was an undeniable truth. The crime was too brutal, too calculated, to stay hidden for long. The pieces would soon begin to fall into place, leading investigators back to Michael and to the devastating answers that would explain Joe's tragic end. The morning after Joe Geeling disappeared, hope still lingered in the hearts of his family and the community of Barry. Search parties combed through streets and parks, calling out his name. But as daylight broke and more hours passed without answers, the sense of unease began to grow. It wasn't long before that hope was replaced by devastation. In Whitehead Park, just a short distance from Joe's home, a member of the search team stumbled upon a sight no one should ever have to witness. There, in an area partially obscured by trees, lay Joe's lifeless body. His small frame, so full of energy and life just a day earlier, now bore the unmistakable marks of violence. The news of Joe's discovery spread rapidly. Officers who arrived at the scene worked quickly to secure the area, but their expressions betrayed the horror of what they had found. Even the most seasoned among them struggled to process the brutal nature of the crime. Joe's family was informed shortly after. The weight of their grief was immeasurable. Friends and neighbors described hearing the cries of his parents as the news reached them. The realization that Joe would never come home again sent shockwaves through the community. Whitehead Park, a place meant for picnics and laughter, was now a crime scene. The vibrant spirit of Barry dimmed as the community grappled with the loss of a boy they had all come to know and love. But even in the midst of this grief, law enforcement knew they had a job to do. Someone had done this, and they wouldn't rest until that person was found. Investigators began their work with urgency, piecing together every detail they could from the crime scene. The evidence was grim: blood, signs of a struggle, and the cruel injuries that had ended Joe's life. Detectives started canvassing the neighborhood, speaking to anyone who might have seen Joe on the day he disappeared. Witnesses described seeing Joe with Michael Hamer after school. It was a lead, but the question remained: what had happened between those two boys? Forensic evidence provided more answers. Traces of Joe's blood were found in Michael's home, linking him directly to the crime. Other physical evidence, including fingerprints, corroborated the growing theory that Michael had been the last person to see Joe alive. When officers brought Michael in for questioning, his demeanor was peculiar. He was composed, almost indifferent. At first, Michael denied any involvement, claiming he hadn't seen Joe after school. But as investigators presented the mounting evidence, the cracks in his story began to show. Under pressure, Michael eventually confessed. He described the events leading to Joe's death, his voice devoid of emotion. To the officers, his recounting felt rehearsed, as though he were describing someone else's actions rather than his own. The confession, while critical, left everyone grappling with more questions than answers. How could a boy so young commit such a brutal act? And what had driven him to such violence? Michael's trial began months later, drawing national attention. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and Joe's grieving family, all seeking justice for the boy whose life had been stolen. The prosecution painted a damning picture of Michael's actions. They detailed how he had forged the note, lured Joe to his home, and carried out the attack with calculated precision. The forensic evidence in Michael's confession left little room for doubt, but the defense argued a different perspective. They highlighted Michael's troubled upbringing, his father's absence, the bullying he endured, and the isolation that shaped his life. They portrayed Michael as a deeply disturbed boy who acted out of a combination of emotional turmoil and mental instability. Psychological experts were called to testify. Some described Michael's actions as those of a boy who had long been simmering with anger and frustration. Others questioned whether he fully understood the consequences of his actions. The trial was grueling for Joe's family, who had to sit through the graphic details of their son's death. Yet they remained steadfast, determined to see justice served. In the end, Michael Hamer was sentenced to a minimum of 12 years in prison. For many, the sentence felt insufficient, a stark reminder of the complexities of juvenile justice. As the courtroom emptied and the case concluded, the questions lingered. Could anything have been done to prevent this tragedy? And what lessons could be learned to ensure no other family would endure such heartbreak? The investigation into Joe's death was a testament to the resilience of his community and the determination of law enforcement. But it was also a somber reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can sometimes reside in the unlikeliest of places. Joe's story didn't end with the trial, nor did the grief that followed. It would remain etched in the hearts of those who knew him, a painful memory of a life cut far too short. Understanding the events that led to Joe Geeling's death requires more than recounting the facts of the crime. To fully grasp how a 14-year-old boy could carry out such an act, we must delve into the psychology of Michael Hamer and examine the social factors that shaped him. What drove Michael to this breaking point? Was it pure malice, or the culmination of years of neglect, rejection, and emotional pain? From an early age, Michael exhibited behaviors that, in retrospect, revealed significant emotional struggles. His abandonment by his father and strained relationship with his mother left a void in his life that he carried with him into adolescence. Children in nurturing environments often develop a sense of security and self-worth. Michael, however, lived in an environment that reinforced feelings of inadequacy and rejection. Over time, Michael learned to cope by detaching himself emotionally. He built walls to protect himself from further pain, but those same walls isolated him from the world. By the time he reached his teens, he had become withdrawn, introverted, and deeply insecure. One of the most striking aspects of Michael's case is his apparent lack of remorse after the crime. Psychological studies suggest that individuals who display emotional detachment, particularly after committing violent acts, often experience a disconnection between their actions and their sense of empathy. This detachment raises unsettling questions. Did Michael fully understand the gravity of his actions? Or had he spent so long suppressing his emotions that he could no longer connect with the humanity of his victim? Experts who examined Michael described him as emotionally stunted, a child trapped in his own pain. But even this analysis offers no easy answers. His actions were deliberate, calculated, and undeniably brutal. Whether these actions were driven by malice or by an inability to process his emotions remains a point of debate. Another critical factor in Michael's life was the persistent bullying he endured. At school, Michael was an outsider, frequently targeted by peers who mocked and excluded him. For a child already struggling with emotional neglect, these experiences compounded his sense of worthlessness. Bullying has long been recognized as a significant risk factor for emotional and behavioral issues in children. Studies have shown that victims of chronic bullying are more likely to experience anxiety, depression, and anger, emotions that, if left unchecked, can manifest in dangerous ways. Michael's case is not unique. There have been other instances of young offenders who acted out violently after enduring years of rejection and humiliation. One case often compared to Michael's is that of Lionel Tate, a 12-year-old boy who fatally injured a 6-year-old girl in Florida. Both cases involve young perpetrators whose actions shocked their communities and raised questions about the impact of childhood trauma. But while these comparisons provide context, they also highlight an uncomfortable truth. The systems meant to protect vulnerable children often fail them. Schools, families, and communities may recognize signs of distress, but lack the resources or awareness to intervene effectively. In Michael's case, the warning signs were there: his isolation, his outbursts, his withdrawal from peers, but they went unnoticed or unaddressed. The question of responsibility looms large in Michael's case. On one hand, his actions were unequivocally wrong, and the pain he caused Joe's family is immeasurable. On the other hand, it's clear that Michael was a product of his environment, shaped by factors beyond his control. Should a 14-year-old be held to the same standards of accountability as an adult? At what point does society bear responsibility for failing to provide the support and intervention that might have prevented such a tragedy? Michael's sentence of 12 years sparked significant debate. For some, it was too lenient, a punishment that failed to reflect the severity of his crime. For others, it was a reminder of the complexities of juvenile justice. Can a child, still in the process of developing emotionally and cognitively, truly comprehend the consequences of such an act? This case forces us to confront difficult ethical questions. If Michael had received proper intervention earlier in life, would Joe still be alive? If his school had addressed the bullying he endured, could his trajectory have been altered? These questions have no easy answers, but they underscore the importance of recognizing and addressing the struggles of children who are at risk. Early intervention, mental health resources, and anti-bullying initiatives are not just preventative measures. They are lifelines for children like Michael. In the end, Michael Hamer's story is a cautionary tale about the far-reaching consequences of neglect, rejection, and isolation. His actions, while unforgivable, did not occur in a vacuum. They were shaped by a web of factors that we, as a society, have a responsibility to address. Joe Geeling's death was a tragedy, but it was also a call to action, a reminder that we must do better for our children. The death of Joe Geeling sent shockwaves far beyond the quiet town of Bury, Greater Manchester. What had once been a close-knit, vibrant community now found itself grappling with the unimaginable, a tragedy that not only took a young life, but also forced everyone to confront difficult truths about childhood, violence, and the systems following Joe's society's most vulnerable. Bury was enveloped in grief. The town, known for its strong community spirit, was united in its mourning. Residents, many of whom had joined the search for Joe, were devastated to learn the outcome. Candlelit vigils were held in his memory, with hundreds gathering to pay their respects. People brought flowers, cards, and handwritten notes, creating a makeshift memorial in Whitehead Park, the site of his discovery. Joe's school became a focal point for the community's grief. Classmates struggled to process the loss of their friend, and teachers found themselves stepping into roles of comforters and counselors. Special assemblies were held, offering students a space to share memories of Joe and express their emotions. Counselors were brought in to help children and staff cope with the trauma, but the scars of this tragedy lingered. Families across Bury began having difficult conversations about safety, trust, and the vulnerabilities of children. Schools implemented stricter protocols, and local organizations launched campaigns to raise awareness about bullying and mental health. The tragedy had exposed cracks in the systems meant to safeguard children, and the community vowed to do better. The ripple effects of Joe's death extended far beyond his immediate circle. His story reached people across the UK, sparking national conversations about the pressures children face and the unseen struggles that can lead to devastating consequences. For Joe's family, the grief was insurmountable. Their home, once filled with laughter and the sound of Joe's cheerful voice, was now silent. In the face of unimaginable pain, they chose to honor Joe's life by keeping his memory alive. A series of memorials were created in Joe's honor. Whitehead Park, forever tied to his story, became the site of a permanent tribute, a bench inscribed with his name, surrounded by flowers planted by his family and friends. The bench became a place for quiet reflection, a symbol of Joe's enduring impact on the community. In the months following his death, Joe's family established initiatives to support causes close to his heart. Fundraisers were organized to benefit cystic fibrosis research, a nod to the condition Joe had battled with grace and resilience. Charity walks, bake sales, and community events were held in his name, each one serving as a reminder of the joy he brought to those around him. His parents, despite their heartbreak, shared stories about Joe in interviews and public appearances. They spoke about his humor, his kindness, and his love for life. Their courage in the face of tragedy inspired countless others, turning their personal loss into a catalyst for change. Joe's school also played a significant role in preserving his legacy. Annual awards were created in his name, celebrating students who embodied Joe's qualities, kindness, humor, and a zest for life. These awards became a way to remind the younger generation of the importance of compassion and community. Through these efforts, Joe's memory was not only preserved but celebrated, ensuring that his life, though tragically short, continued to make a difference. The tragedy of Joe's death brought to light critical issues that extended far beyond Barry. It forced society to confront the vulnerabilities of children and the systems meant to protect them. One of the clearest lessons was the importance of early intervention for children in distress. Michael Hamer's story underscored the devastating consequences of untreated emotional struggles. Had his challenges been identified and addressed earlier, whether through counseling, mentorship, or community support, could this tragedy have been avoided? The case also highlighted the need for stronger anti-bullying measures. Schools were urged to take a more proactive role in addressing bullying, fostering environments where every child felt safe and supported. Programs promoting kindness, empathy, and mental health awareness became a priority, aiming to create a culture where children like Michael would feel included rather than isolated. Mental health services, particularly for young people, came under scrutiny. Experts called for increased funding, better access to resources, and more comprehensive training for educators and caregivers. The hope was that by equipping adults with the tools to recognize and respond to signs of distress, future tragedies could be prevented. Joe's story also served as a reminder of the power of community. While the systems in place had failed to protect Joe, the response to his death demonstrated the resilience and compassion of the people around him. Their collective grief transformed into collective action, proving that even in the face of unspeakable loss, there is strength in unity. As the years passed, Joe's legacy continued to inspire change. His story became a call to action, a reminder that protecting children requires vigilance, empathy, and a commitment to creating a world where every child feels safe and valued. For the people of Barry, Joe was more than a victim of a tragic crime. He was a symbol of hope, a reminder of the light that even one young life can bring to the world. And while his death left a void that could never be filled, his memory served as a beacon, guiding efforts to ensure that no family, no community, would ever endure such pain again.